Welcome to all our viewers to this special episode, Security Europeans. Now, in light of the cry of the head of the Council, a challenge for the European Union, first and foremost Ukraine, but the obstacles are domestic, polarization and political party disagreements, economic problems, debt and popular discontent regarding the healthcare. Europe in the new year, witnessing many problems. We saw previously the Russian-NATO confrontation, a complex discussion about the balance between preserving the alliances and getting rid of affiliation, with the readiness of the so-called isolationist to take up the American presidency. Europe, which came out of transformations in major countries which are awaiting elections that might be decisive. Germany, Romania, Poland, Norway. Then after that, elections which might rebalance the geopolitical map, whereby the biggest force in the Union is described as the sick man. What kind of Europe? Now, we're joined by Aktham Suleiman from Berlin. We also welcome from Athens, political or economic professor in the University of Cardiff, Abdel Latif Darwish, and from London we welcome expert in international affairs, Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Welcome to all of you. Before we start, let's take a look at the European crises in 2024. Trust becoming a nightmare at the start of Donald Trump's second term. Many challenges: economy, energy, defense, the Ukrainian crisis. The options are very limited. Let's take a look at the following report. (2024) for Europe was the year of weakness in the country, whilst it was facing unique challenges, unprecedented rise of the far right. France, ever since Emmanuel Macron dissolved the National Assembly, has entered a period of political instability with a divided parliament. The far right represents one of the stronger blocs, Germany, whereby the party of Olaf Scholz decreased to less than 17%, and the alternative extreme party also is threatening with 20%. The European economy is passing through a bad phase, with the increase in debt to around 90% of the GDP, and in continuation of the inflation and also decrease in purchasing power. This could become a nightmare with Donald Trump starting his second term, whereby the European fears evolve around three levels. First of all, the Ukrainian war. Donald Trump, who brags always of his good ties with Russian President Vladimir Putin, insists on going towards a settlement via negotiations with Russia on account of territories taken by Russia. This puts Europe in front of options which are bad and those which are worse, especially when Zelensky says that Ukraine can't continue with the war with only European support. The second is Trump's threat regarding a Russian attack and not defending the Europeans against a Russian attack, except if they increase their defense spending. The third is economy, which is related to the raise or the increase of tariffs on European products at the percentage reaching 20%. And Goldman Sachs expects that if Trump follows through on these economic ideals or proposals, then the European economy would suffer greatly. The Europeans are up against very difficult choices, so they have to create a kind of balance between preserving historic ties with the American partner, at the same time putting together their own strategy to defend their economic and security interests. So the European country's strategy for the upcoming 4 years doesn't need a lot of assumptions and analysis. The start of Trump's new term for them will set the compass regarding the economy specifically and the foreign policy. Ukraine, Middle East and ties with China. That was a report from our correspondent in Geneva. Mr. Aktham, I'll start with you. It seems that the expectations for Europe next year are not rosy. If not even they're going to be a storm. It's as if this continent, Mr. Aktham, is living a curse ever since the end of the first decade of the millennium. Consecutive crises. Why? The answer is greetings to you and to the guests and to the viewers. I'm not sure, but let's look objectively. There is a mistake in both. Europe, the so-called European Union, started as a very different idea. If we go back to the 1950s, it was only an economic project. The reconciliation after World War II, after that, especially after the end of the Cold War, it became this wide structure which includes more than 20 countries. This structure, which includes different opinions and different interests, and there is control of certain policies without there having a structure supporting it. So an institution which was born economically, they wanted to become political institution. This is something difficult in any transformation. So this is no special, unique circumstance. We're living the results. We add to this, after all of those problems, if I could call them European domestic problems, you have the relationship with the other. The ties with the East, with Russia, have not seen stability. There were better years and there was talk about European security, etc. Of course, things ended differently. Now the ties with the West, and specifically with Washington. Europe is losing any special roles to Washington. It's becoming more and more under Washington's control, economically wise, foreign policy in various areas. And if you want to get an idea, look at our region. Where is France's policy today towards Lebanon or towards Syria or towards other countries, or Britain, which is completely out of sight? We can't see a trace of any of them in light of the American and the Israeli domination. So there is a treat also when it comes to European foreign ties. This is not to mention the very wrong steps domestically. Dr. Papadopoulos, so Mr. Aktham, says that there is maybe a tarnishing, or there's been a mistake ever since the birth of this union. Janus Emmanuel Dest says that he's not optimistic when it comes to the next year or the new year. He says the EU is no longer the solution for various issues, and policy has become more nationalist in light of the spread of the political trends, if we would say, in the EU countries. The unity of the continent reflected by this union. Is it still a source of strength for it?
Let us be very clear about something. The European Union is not Europe, and Europe is most certainly not the European Union. Secondly, by regurgitating Zionist terminology, i.e. far right, that is a very dangerous terminology to use, because that Zionist term is aimed at suppressing the cultural and spiritual values of Western nations. I am delighted that all across Europe, patriotic or nationalist parties are emerging and are becoming stronger by the day. The ordinary people of Europe are aware that Europe has a cancer in the form of the European Union and NATO. The leadership of the European Union and the leadership of NATO care nothing for ordinary people in Europe. They care nothing for the culture of the European people. So that is why, for example, you see in Germany that the nationalist party, AfD, could be on the verge of power. Europe is fed up. Europe has become an extremely dangerous place. The Western ruling elites who rule Europe have brought immigrants from outside of the Western world into Europe to destroy Europe from within. That is why the European people are absolutely furious. The European Union is in serious trouble. And if patriotic or nationalist parties come to power in various European countries, for example in Germany, that could be a lethal blow to the European Union. And if the European Union collapses, that will be a good thing for international peace and international stability. Let us not forget the European Union played a major role in bringing Al-Qaeda to power in Syria. The European Union plays a major role in harming the Palestinian people. The European Union gives a blank check year in, year out to Israel to allow Israel to commit genocide against the Palestinian people. Again, the European Union is not Europe, and Europe is most certainly not the European Union. Ordinary people in Europe, be it British people, Germans or French, want nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. They want nothing to do with ISIS. They want nothing to do with Israel. They wish Europe to be European again. And I hope people in the Middle East understand why patriotic or nationalist parties are on the rise in Europe, and ordinary people in the Middle East should support those parties.
So in light of that, I'll go to Mr. Abdul Latif Darwish. You're the professor in the University of Cardiff, to ask you, Europe, which was always a symbol for economic prosperity. Today, Mario Draghi, who is the former head of the European Central Bank and former Italian Prime Minister, in our memorandum, and he participated in writing 400 pages regarding the European economy. He says the ongoing economic deterioration in the old continent, so much so that it's slowly dying. How did we reach this phase when it comes to the economy in Europe? The answer there is an inconvenient, unhealthy marriage between the European monopoly companies and the European regimes that are hostage to the companies. And as the guest said, I think he is Greek, Mr. Papadopoulos, what's happening, the displacement of Syria or Lebanon and the crisis, it was a result of European practices to strike the economies of this region and hence to benefit from this migration to Europe. So it's not a natural attack, it's by force. They are refugees, not immigrants. They went there, they left because of the circumstances. There is no European leadership in Europe. There are technocrats, employees who work for the companies, and they completely follow the US lead. And a lot of the decisions which were made by the European Union, starting off, for example, boycotting Iran, the EU lost around 600 billion worth of projects which the European companies and European interests in European countries could have benefited from. They also used to get Libyan and Iranian oil facilitated, especially Greece. They lost these as well. And going to war in Ukraine, it was part of the affiliation following the American policy. So the absence of the European leadership and not uniting the European economic regimes. There are European economies, not one economy. Some of them conflict with one another. The European debt in France, for example, it reaches 30%. One of the main countries, the European or the Ukrainian war, destroyed the German economy. So these governments are subject to the companies and American policy, and hence they don't reflect the interests of the Greeks or the European citizens. There is a housing crisis, a a crisis in terms of high costs. For example, some of the health facilities, even some of the masks were taken control of. Even NATO, which was considered to be the competitor of China, was forced to request China's assistance to get the face masks. So these countries and governments, can they reflect the interest of the European citizen? Of course not. The elite lives in its own world and serves the companies which also support them in the electoral campaigns, and the rise of the nationalist parties is a result of this failed policy, which led to the euro, which was around $1.40, now it's around $1. And this inflation in the economy led to unemployment and led to economic problems, and also problems between European countries. And also when it comes to oil, for example, the stance of the Czech Republic and the visit to Putin, this shows that there is no united European stance or united European interest. In light of what you said, and what my two guests said from Athens and Berlin, it seems that there are threats in 2025. It's on the verge of the abyss. This is what Washington Post says. It said that Europe finds itself facing a pile-up of threats. Its voters are angry, its parties are fragmented, the economies are slow, and the East is being gobbled up. A catastrophic war. 7 of the member countries in the EU are being ruled by extremist parties, completely or partially. Germany and France, after the continent relied on them to exercise their will and to draw their approach, they seem today not ready and not capable of ruling. The centre-right and centre-left have lost momentum in both countries. The situation is deteriorating. There are widespread fears that Europe might be approaching the abyss, whereby the previous assumptions about the social stability and the social security benefits are now decreasing. You have also not only the Americans and Chinese, but the Russian president might find in the incapability of Europe the possibility of attracting countries and making them the affiliates of Russia. I go back to Mr. Aktham. Germany and France, which should have rose with the European continent, they were drowned and also witnessed domestic disagreements or divisions. What kind of repercussions will we see, especially when the continent is going to face hurdles, and maybe even what is even beyond hurdles? If we look at Ukraine, the answer is, let's start with what the so-called motor, as they call it, the German-French motor. What's the story? This dynamo played a historic role in World Wars I and World War II. The two countries confronted each other, and for this reason the European group was established before the European Union, and as I said before, it was economic. And the first generation, if we were to speak about presidents like Mitterrand, de Gaulle, the Adenauer, Helmut Schmidt, Philip Brown, they were all from the generation of World War II, or at least the children of that generation at the maximum, because they lived the experience, whether it be in their childhood or when they were older. Now we are in the era of the former Chancellor Angela Merkel, Olaf Scholz in France, Sarkozy, and now Emmanuel Macron, a generation which is far away from this history. So it needs to renew, actually, this dynamo. History is no longer sufficient. It's become an empty slogan. You need something new. And they haven't found anything new. There were attempts made here and there to speak about a united army, one army, united common defense. However, on the ground, the result was that the expansion of the European Union in this way led to these two countries rising. And number two, some people in their analysis of the dynamo thought it was about the dynamo and the countries around them, but actually the dynamo has a life inside Europe, inside France and Germany. There are social, economic movements. A lot has changed. I mentioned history and the memories of the war, but there are topics which are more important. What is the definition of European socialism today? No one knows. What are the conservative values in Europe today? Nobody knows. What are the major parties, or which are the major parties today? Europe is different than it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Conservative parties here and socialist parties. So these were the two big, and between them the so-called radical parties. There's become political fragmentation. In the French elections, you see results 18% for 4 or 5 parties. The same phenomenon now has hit Germany. Germany, ruled by Olaf Scholz, it says today that he didn't get more than 17% of the vote, something which he could not have imagined before, because there is also fragmentation in politics. Let's call it a crisis in the democratic system in dealing with societies whose wishes and whose affiliations differ than that which used to be known before traditionally. And maybe what is happening in Ukraine is increasing these divisions. I'd like to ask Mr. Papadopoulos about Ukraine. Is Ukraine considered to be the biggest nightmare for the European continent? And today, when we hear that an agreement can be reached for a ceasefire, this is what Trump promised. This agreement, is it considered to be a lifeline for the European countries, or will it be like bullets of mercy?
Russia is not an enemy to Europe. The European Union is an enemy of Russia. Russia is part of Europe. In geographical terms, Europe ends at the Ural Mountains in Russia. So Russia is very much a part of Europe. Russia has no malicious intentions towards the nations of Europe. And when I say the nations of Europe, I mean the nations of Europe, the indigenous people, the Christians, not the people who have been imported into Europe by the Western ruling elites and Zionists to eradicate the presence of the indigenous peoples of Europe. So, in regard to the European Union has made Europe suffer because of the sanctions that the European Union has placed on Russia, and as a result, Russia has placed sanctions on the European Union. The European Union does not serve the European people. The European Union hates the European people. The European Union serves the Western ruling elites and Zionists. In regard to the war in Ukraine, sooner or later, and I suspect sooner, the Russian army will emerge victorious, and either all or most of Ukraine will be captured by the Russians. And at that point, the European Union will not be able to do anything against Russia. In regard to Trump is a complex man. When it comes to foreign policy, it is very clear that Trump does not want to be associated with any wars. That includes the war in Ukraine, and that includes the wars in the Middle East. So Trump will try to secure an end to the war in Ukraine. I think that will take a very long period of time. But what we should also be mindful of is this. The European Union is still importing Russian natural resources, such as oil, gas, coal, and timber. So what does it show? It shows the European Union needs Russia, but still, many companies across Europe have gone into liquidation because of the European Union's sanctions on Russia. The German economy is in a terrible state because of the European Union's actions towards Russia. Again, that is why the nations of Europe are rising, and they are rising with the aim of liberating Europe from the cancer that is the European Union and NATO.
it's interesting when you say, Mr. Papadopoulos, that the fragmentation of the EU countries and focusing on the sovereignty of each country will contribute in the growth of the continent and the advance of the people and the economies of this continent. But how do you view maybe the implementation of such ideas, bearing in mind that Brexit took years and years until it took place?
Let us be very clear. The European Union and the British establishment are two sides of the same coin. The British establishment is an enemy of the British people. Brexit means nothing. For example, take immigration. Even though Britain is no longer a member of the European Union, the British establishment is still importing vast amounts of immigrants legally or illegally into the UK. And that has devastated British society. That has devastated the very fabric of what it is to be British. And remember, the British people are comprised of four nations: the English, the Scottish, the Welsh, and the Northern Irish. So too much attachment has been placed to Brexit. Let us not forget as well how the British establishment and the European Union leadership came together to prosecute an economic war against Russia. The British establishment and the European Union have also come together to prosecute a brutal war against the Palestinian people, and the British establishment and the European Union leadership came together to bring Al-Qaeda to power in Syria. And in regard to Syria, the British establishment and the European Union leadership will now participate in plundering Syria of its natural resources and of its industries. So that is why there is no difference between the European Union and the British establishment, or indeed the American establishment. They all comprise what I call the Western ruling elites.
Dr. Abdul-Latif, when Dr. Papadopoulos says that the German economy is suffering as a result of this war between Russia and Ukraine, here I'd like to ask, this war shook the thrones of many of the European economies, many of which was exhausted to begin with as a result of COVID and the repercussions. Which country was inflicted more pain? I'd like to give you the answer. I'd like to give you an example. The EU lost business dealings worth $365 billion. All of the strawberry from Greece used to go to Russia. As a result of the sanctions and the gas coming off, the cost of the infrastructure, because Germany, for example, got used to importing the Russian gas via the pipelines. Now the infrastructure must be re-prepared in many European countries. Germany lost around 200 billion in order to re-prepare the infrastructure. So the countries that rely on Russian gas, like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Germany, and many countries, they suffered when it comes to the infrastructure and gas. The European Union, before the crisis, imported American gas worth 16 billion. Now it's 68 billion. So the costs have increased triple. The US gives gas at very high prices to the EU, and importing the Qatari or American gas from long distances is also very costly at a time where it used to get it with very cheap prices from Russia. Going to the battle in Ukraine, the US ordered this, and those who are paying the price for this war are the Europeans. Imagine that when it goes to some countries like Sweden, Holland, and countries in Northern Europe, and every day the warning sirens go off preparing for war, and citizens are called on to store water or food, because they expect a war with Russia. This means that the economic crisis or this situation will lead to the migration of the wealthy. So we are witnessing a sharp economic crisis. which the European Union suffers from because they pursued the same American policies. Donald Trump wants to end the war, so America started the war and ends the war. Where is Europe's role regarding this war, despite the fact that the European Union paid the price? The Europeans went to Afghanistan, they followed the US lead, and they weren't even informed that there were talks with the Taliban. So the absence of a leadership, the absence of a united economic policy, the distancing of this elite and the way they are operating far away from citizens' wishes led to this crisis. They relied on Russian gas and commerce with Russia, and a country like Greece relied on around 6 to 8 billion, relied on Russian tourism, which brought about this sum, about 8 billion. For example, there's also that which relates the Russian property. So what Mr. Papadopoulos says, if Mr. Papadopoulos would write about this in a European newspaper or institution, he wouldn't be allowed, and those who criticize this European policy could be thrown into jail because they object to the stance against Russia. So if we look at the situation in the new year, deep changes witnessed in the continent over the past months. Let's take a look at the following report. So Europe witnessed in 2024 unprecedented political crises and changes in those in power which didn't happen for decades or since decades. People from the far right coming to power. In Germany, for example, Turingen witnessed the victory of the Alternative Party with 32%, and this is the first victory for a far-right party in local elections ever since World War II. And the German parliament also withdrew confidence from Olaf Scholz, and this showed that the Chancellor lost with a large margin. There was also a big political event, the fall of the government of Michel Barnier, the Prime Minister in France, after 3 months only. The historic victory of the French far right in the European elections led President Emmanuel Macron to dissolve the National Assembly and hold early legislative elections, to go back and confess at the end of the year that dissolving the National Assembly led to more divisions than it led to solution for the French people. The rise of the right parties was repeated in a number of other countries in the old continent, Italy, Spain, Sweden and others. Economically, the European continent witnessed a number of major events which had an impact on the economies of the countries. Inflation remained a major concern in a number of European countries, and especially in light of the slow recovery after COVID and with the ongoing war in Ukraine. So the price of oil and food continued to have a big impact on the purchasing power of the citizens, especially in Germany and France. So based on what our colleague Mr. Mohammed Bazi said, I'll go back to Mr. Aktham Suleiman, the rise of the right parties, or the nationalist parties, as the guest from Athens called them, but it extends to Germany and threatens the alliance or coalition of Scholz and threatens his return to rule in the anticipated elections. What kind of Germany can we expect to see in 2025? Germany, which used to be viewed maybe as one of the most important members of this group, it was seen as being the leader of the European continent, and so even the leading members are trembling and suffering from Alzheimer. These are the developments. Germany, the future Germany is an unstable one. For example, the report referred to what happened in France or Germany, whether it be withdrawing the confidence or dissolving the National Assembly. What are we witnessing? The Arab citizen might not be really well acquainted with the policies of these two countries. In brief, there's a political system. When they reach a crisis, they have tools they use to confront this crisis. In France, it was the dissolving of the parliament. In Germany, withdrawing the confidence. Others, early elections. In other countries, other methods. Now, what's the problem? The problem is that these methods are no longer bearing fruit. They no longer are effective in confronting the daily problems. So for this reason, the German Chancellor raised the issue of confidence. He lost it. The elections will be repeated. The opposing Christian party will come. The so-called nationalist party problem will continue, and he will back down. In principle, like the competitor before backed down and he went ahead. So you're going around in the same circle, and you discover it's a structural issue. There's a structural problem in Germany, France, and elsewhere, not a ordinary political problem. Now, regarding the patriotic parties, the parties or the strength of these parties doesn't lie in themselves, in the parties themselves. First of all, they are parties that protest. Every time they see something not worthy of respect or confidence, they go and take a stance. Electing right is objection or protest. It's no longer electing left. We saw this in France, in Britain. These parties, the colleagues mentioned the identity and the elite and the economy and the globalization. There's a return of the identity. French, German, my culture is European. The other parties look at everyone only as consumers and producers, and that's a secret of their strength. Protesting on the one hand and identity on the second, and between brackets, also the unwise policies pursued by other parties. So they come out hence with this magnitude of support as a reaction against what is happening. Mr. Papadopoulos, I go back to you. Around 500 million people, different identities, different cultures. Now, most of the youth are united by a sense of anger. To what extent is this linked maybe to the continent lacking strong leaders who enjoy or have a vision for the future? And to what extent is this feeling of anger, to what extent could it be a warning?
The nations of Europe, of all ages and of all social backgrounds, are angry. Very, very, very angry. First of all, they see that their economies have been exploited by the European Union leadership. The European Union leadership is profiting from the economies of Europe. In simple English, they are stealing vast amounts of money from European economies through their policies. Secondly, the European Union has put Europe into an economic war with the Russian Federation. That war is not in the interests of the European people, but it is in the interests of the European Union leadership. And thirdly, and possibly most important of all, the European Union leadership is waging a cultural war against the people of Europe. And the people of Europe are now revolting. They are now rising because they do not wish to see their cultural identity destroyed, be it the Greek identity or the German identity or the French identity or the Italian identity. They don't want to see their religion, Christianity, attacked any longer. And the European Union leadership is responsible for this war against the nations of Europe. Let me clarify. I am part English, part German, and part Greek. 100% European, and I see the catastrophic impact on Europe, on the nations, the ancient nations of Europe, as a result of the European Union's leadership, its political policies, its economic policies, and its social policies, by which I mean importing vast amounts of people from outside of Europe into Europe. That has brought about terrible levels of crime. That has decimated cultures, and that has caused a very big problem for Christianity all around Europe. I don't want to see Arab culture affected. I want to see Arab culture remain and remain permanently. I also want to see my own culture, European culture, remain and remain permanently. That is why I say to people in the Middle East, you should support the rise of patriotic and nationalist parties in Europe, because these parties are anti-EU, they are anti-NATO, they are anti-Zionist, and they do not want any wars of intervention in the Middle East.
Clear. So Europe suffers from a vacuum in leadership. So how will it do with Trump? A question posed by New York Times, which spoke about economic or political chaos and instability, denying Europe a strong leadership. So it's become the major power. It confronts Trump. Actually, the American president is an expert in political theater. They must not be subject to division or provoking from Trump, but making sure Trump has a seat in any talks. So talk is easier than action in light of the different parties. Even the European Commission wants to play an important role under leadership of Ursula von der Leyen by going to European strong leaders. This might enhance the stance of Europe. I'll go back to you, Dr. Abdul Latif, the European Commission. Now, there are fears at more than one level. First of all, they are afraid, for example, of Trump's wishes regarding his intent to raise the tariffs and also increasing the European contributions to NATO with a percentage which might be difficult for some European economies and might be beyond the ability of some of these economies. Here I want to ask you, is Europe ready for Trump, who is returning? The answer is, of course, no. First of all, Trump wants American interests. America's debt reaches 35 trillion. There's a problem in the infrastructure in America, but Trump will hold the Europeans and the allies, Canada, Europe. He will make them pay the price for the American bases, the so-called protection, Chinese danger, Russian. So he will focus on American interests. Trump does not see any interests, whether it be for the Gulf countries. He only sees the American interests. They are above anything else. Unfortunately, because of the absence of leadership, they will pay to Trump and they'll be victims. In order for there to be a crime, there has to be a victim. The victims won't have to be the enemies, but also the allies. They will pay a price as a result of the American stances. So he who decided the war on Ukraine, the US, and those who will pay the price for the war are the Europeans. Now, Trump's policy, he wants to focus on China, so he will solve the problem with Russia, and hence the European Union will also boycott China and wage war or participate in this campaign, despite the fact there are common interests with the Chinese economy. So America is leading the conflict and we are paying the price, whether it be in the east or the west. So the Europeans will pay the price. They will pay also the tariffs. They will boycott China just like they did with Russia without knowing why they did it. They boycotted Iran, so there is no independent policy. They'll continue to be the victims even in Trump's war against China. This is what will happen in the future. I'll go at the end to Mr. Aktham. It's as if Europe cannot live with America and cannot live without it. Some say the solution lies in European first policy. What do you think? The answer is there are such ties. You can't do with, you can't do without. But I think when it comes to Europe, it's not that innocent. Europe needs America and America needs, but organizing the ties between the two, which goes back to after World War II. And they were affiliated because the Americans entered the war and they controlled Western Europe and imposed a model. This required a revision. It required development. This did not happen. The result was that Europe said protection is on America's soldiers, we provide the money. And once again, we speak about the German, French, it didn't take into consideration the domestic changes in America reflected by President Trump. President Trump is an alternative presented by the elite. We have a conflict in the elite. Some are represented by Biden, Obama, and others represented by Donald Trump. However, they're not ready to cooperate. And they're not ready to cooperate with other alternatives from within their societies, like the nationalist parties, which the honorable guest spoke about. And here you're witnessing the very, very catastrophic situation of the European system. When you have alternatives from within the system being dealt with in such a way, Trump was boycotted in the first term. They tried to set minefields for him at the start, like they do with the right wing in their own societies. When they deal with the situation this way, this means that the system is approaching its end because there is no way to deal with any other opinion. This reminds us of the end of communism, when any communist who had new ideas was accused of being from the counter-revolution. These indeed are the real problems, and so Trump did not cause them. However, he's exposing them via his presence in of itself as something different from that which existed for tens of years. Thank you very much. Media personality, political analyst, Maktab Salom from Berlin. Thank you very much from Athens. Economic professor from Cardiff University, Mr. Abdul Latif Darwish. And thank you very much also to Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, who's an expert on international affairs. Thank you very much.